once the vice presidential candidate for the Green Party in 2016. What impact could a third party have on the monopoly of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party of U.S. politics?
Well, what it could have is to expand the space of political discourse and provide the U.S. population with more choice. But there are some objective structural contradictions. Um, the duopoly, as we refer to it, the two main parties that basically control the political process that represent the class interests of the bourgeoisie in the U.S. They have structured the election laws in such a way where it becomes very, very difficult and in some cases impossible for a so-called third party to run. We faced that back in 2016 we were able to get on the ballot in 46 states, uh, the presidential ballot. But in 2020, the Green Party candidate was only able to get on the ballot in 30 states, and they had the write-in in the other states. And in fact, what happened also was that the Democrat Party engaged in a process of suing various uh, state processes, like in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, to keep the Green Party off of the ballot, and they were successful. So the monopoly is intact. It would expand democracy if there was a real democracy in the U.S. But right now, democracy in the U.S. is still aspirational, if you will. What we find today is that we have a shell, a form of democracy. But what we have, in fact, is a dictatorship of the capitalist class. So reform seems to be almost impossible. What needs to take place is a complete restructuring of these processes, and what that suggests is a fundamental restructuring of the entire edifice of governance in the U.S. In other words, we need radical change in the U.S. if we're going to be able to, at some point, establish a democracy that corresponds to the conditions of the U.S.
When you commented on the Summit for the Americas, you suggested U.S. diplomacy is dominated by white supremacy. Do you think the U.S.-China policy is somewhat affected by white supremacy?
Of course. And Trump understood that it would be much easier to galvanize support for aggressive U.S. policies vis-a-vis China than even Russia. Why? Because of the issue of racialization, the issue of white supremacy, the psychopathology of white supremacy, in which uh, uh, people who are infected with this disease find it impossible to 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 relate to deal with people with dignity, and equality in an equal way. So yes, I think that the anti-China uh, potentiality is there. We saw it already in the U.S. With some of the violence, the irrational violence that that was directed toward people of Chinese descent, people who have lived in the U.S. for a few hundred years. Um, and that was just the tip of the iceberg, we believe. And so yes, white supremacy is what's driving much of U.S. policy, and is driving the policy in ways that seem to reflect that there are people making critical decisions for U.S. Policies that seem to be delusional. They cannot accept the fact that they are quickly um, uh, 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 facing the real prospect of the end of white world supremacy. and they can't handle it.
It seems that the two main political parties in the US can only reach consensus on China-related affairs. Meanwhile, the solution to many problems in the US depends on China. How do you see such contradictions?
It's important to note that there were real divisions within the foreign policy community vis-a-vis China up until the Trump administration. Even Trump himself was more committed to trying to galvanize a, uh, a support for his focus on China. He wanted to pivot away from the conflict and the tensions with Russia, but he wasn't allowed to do that at first. But gradually, he was able to win most of the ruling elements over to his focus on China, and that's what we saw the so-called trade wars. We saw the continuation of the so-called pivot to Asia, and the Biden administration has in fact continued that, but they have again doubled down. It's unfortunately it's probably going to continue to deteriorate unless we're able to build a more effective anti-war, an anti-imperialist movement in the United States of America. It's quite clear that, and the U.S. policymakers have made it clear in their policy statements, that they're still committed to the doctrine of full spectrum dominance. They're not hiding this, and it's understandable that the Chinese government and the Russian government feel like they have no one to negotiate with, no one to talk to. Where are the adults? Where are the stabilizing forces? Where are the forces mature enough to understand?
In one of your tweets, you said that the public sees clearly that the raid of Trump's home in Florida by the FBI constitutes government overreach and a partisan move. What do you think is the purpose of the FBI's moves?
Well, it appears to me that the strategy on the part of the Democrats are twofold. One is to provide a basis to disqualify Trump for running in 2024. But secondly, to also undermine his influence, so that the problem with this, though, is that it's a very dangerous strategy because Trump received the second highest votes in U.S. history, which is 74 million votes. Of course, Biden came in number one. Um, so the attempt to undermine the ability of Trump to run again with that kind of social base is running the risk of further destabilizing the society politically. Is already in a crisis, and it's already a crisis of legitimacy when it comes to all of the U.S. Institutions. And it seems that this strategy in this fragile environment is such that the consequences can be completely unknown. It could be very violent, or it could be other kinds of consequences that we can't even imagine. So it's a very dangerous strategy.